Dave, what's happening, man? Thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
It's been a while. I'm glad to catch up. But without further ado, let's just jump right into this and let's give a little bit of insight into kind of your background and origin story for those that are unfamiliar with your work and your career.
Sure. Yeah, I was a soccer player, lifelong soccer player, had a small professional career, did not finish my undergrad because I went overseas to try to have a professional career and played indoors professionally for a few years and then came back and finished undergrad in a interdisciplinary degree called coaching science. Went enrolled in the master's at George Mason that time and was a college coach for a couple of years there while I was doing the exercise science degree, and had the opportunity to go to MLS, starting as a fitness coach slash goalkeeper coach in Kansas City. In 2009, went to Seattle, where I think kind of started down this path of really creating a sports science department. And over the course of the 9 years I was with Seattle, formed this high performance sports science department with 4 or 5 staff members, and then had the opportunity in 2017 to go to the Orlando Magic to be high performance director there in the NBA for 3 years, and then I just wrapped up 4 years with Austin FC as high performance director.
I feel like there's one question because you and I both transitioned to MLS and the NBA the same offseason. And I think there was one question you and I fielded quite a bit. And now I'm just curious after MLS, NBA, back to MLS for a few years, how would you compare and contrast the two leagues from your perspective as a high performance director?
I think there's two pieces. I think first, your schedule drives so much of the type of work you'll end up doing, right? The number of games you have, the training rhythm. When you're in MLS and you've got lots of Saturday to Saturday weeks where you can really create a true training week, you can have clear objectives and goals over the course of the week. You're prepping, you're trying to taper, and then you go in the cycles of the NBA, or every 8 days you're playing 3, 4, or 5 games and you're trying to recover in between, and there's no real training. So that really affects how you do the job of the high performance director first, I think. And then two, I think what I found is that, my biggest strength as a practitioner, having, played at a decent level, was understanding the sport, understanding what the coaches were trying to do, understanding what the goal of every training session was from a tactical perspective. And then you can wrap the physical around that as well. And then going to a sport like basketball, where I really didn't know the NBA game well at all, and kind of felt like I was always trying to come to terms with what the goal of the coaches were on a daily basis. And also I think how important understanding the sport can be when we're in these roles.
One question I get sometimes is like, in order to work into a sport, you have to understand it. And like what I heard right there was it can be beneficial, but it may not be necessary. Would you agree with that perspective? Or do you think, no, if you're going to work in the sport, it's really helpful to and behooves you to understand it at a finer detail?
I think as a type of practitioner that each one of us is. I mean, for me, I feel like that was a huge strength of mine, was understanding the sport of soccer, that I didn't feel like was a strength when I went to the NBA. It's a good question, but I think that we should understand the sport as best we can, because we have to understand what the goals of the coaches are on a daily basis as they work with their teams.
When you would hire people, because that was a big part of your role and everywhere you've been,
Yeah.
how one perspective I had when it came to like, do you need sport experience or not, was also like the what the role of that provider was going to be. So for example, someone that's a high performance director in soccer, I think I would want to hire someone that understands soccer to your level. If I were to compare apples to compare, like I had two candidates, one that understands soccer, one that doesn't. Probably want the one that understands soccer in that type of role versus, hey, I'm bringing on an assistant athletic trainer and I need to really, be a taskmaster and they can take care of a lot of the day to day. Maybe understanding sport isn't as important. When you went about hiring, did those perspectives ever come to mind, or you weigh those options?
Yeah, yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, again, when you ask the question what a high performance director should have, I think the high performance director should understand the sport. As a high performance director builds out their staff, I think that diversity and cognitive diversity within your staff is really important. I don't think that you've played the sport and you hire a bunch of staff members that have all played the sport and you all kind of see the world the same way. I don't think that leads to great decision making, great challenging of each other. So yeah, I think the really skillful high performance directors from the leadership standpoint understand kind of the puzzle of the staffing and having different people that think in different ways. I think that's a real critical piece.
I didn't want to go here, but this is you've piqued my
Uh-oh.
interest, and you piqued my interest, and because I know I know you've thought about these things. There's two questions I want to double click on. Is one, this perspective of cognitive diversity and having too much where it gets noisy, but then having none where there's none, and everyone's thinking the same way. Like that's point one, and point two I want to go to is people that are in these management roles. I've had like I've observed this, like not necessarily like you can be a manager of the high performance team and manage the medical side or manage the performance side, albeit you don't have the credentialing or technical skill set to do those tasks. So it's like there's the management piece and then there's the cognitive diversity that you talk to. And I
Yeah.
believe they blend a little bit, but I just wanted to segregate those. So could you speak upon your perspective on how much cognitive diversity versus how much cognitive diversity you believe is needed and valuable within a high performance team?
Yeah. Good question. Yeah, I think, and again, as I kind of went through this role as high performance director, I actually felt that the next step for me educationally was to do a doctorate in organizational leadership and development. So I did that and kind of did this deep dive into the research around cognitive diversity, and it is very much a inverted U relationship between amount of cognitive diversity in your staff or your team and team performance, where you have to all be speaking the same language. You have to have a certain level of understanding of where each other's perspectives are, but then be able to challenge those perspectives, I think, in a healthy way. And if you are so far down the cognitive diversity side that you just can't even understand how this person on your team sees the world the way they see it, you're never going to find common ground. And so you will not perform at a particularly high level. So I think there's that side. There is a sweet spot of cognitive diversity where you want enough of variability in thought while still having some level of common ground, I think. One. I think two, the next piece, the high performance director and the high performance director who is a leader across this interdisciplinary group is, what came up through my studies was that the best people in these roles really became facilitators and they were no longer practitioners. And I think it was a really important transition that people have to have of, I am now a facilitator of performance, medical, sports science, nutrition, psychology, all these, and I need to make sure that we are all playing well together, understanding each other, figuring out where our if we had Venn diagram, where we were crossing over in the different disciplines, because the crossovers are really important, and then facilitating how that group functions together, rather than I am the leader of this group. I am a decision maker. We're going to do this, and we're going to do rehab like this, and we're going to do strength training like this, and I want my psychologist to be like this. That's not the role of the high performance director. The high performance director is truly the facilitator of this interdisciplinary department that celebrates this diversity and crossover between areas of thought.
I appreciate that perspective, and where this was coming from is I've seen in a lot of team settings, the person that's necessarily has been there the longest or is very technically proficient. It just seems like it's the natural progression that this person becomes the VP of health and performance in the basketball space, or they become the high performance director, or they step into that management role. And then you realize that technical skill set and the ability to be good in the day to day and with the players doesn't always translate to a high performance director or manager being successful in that space. Because I think some people, not some people, I think it can be, including myself, it can be tough to let go of those personal preferences or biases when you go from that technical day to day, to like you alluded to, being able to manage everything and allowing that diversity to happen, even if it's not what you would do in that situation. You know that it's fitting within the overall system. It was just an observation I had, and you nailed it. You touched
Yeah.
on it quite a
Yeah.
bit.
And it's funny because now that I've stepped away from Austin and I'm speaking to several different head coaches and sporting directors, GMs throughout MLS, the common theme amongst these discussions are, performance and medical just fight all the time, and people are afraid to go and talk to the coaches about where players are at and what they, who's struggling and not struggling, and we've got a flawed decision making process through our performance medical space, precisely because it's a leadership issue, right? It's not a lack of disciplinary understanding. It is how we go about making decisions, how we inform people about our decisions, how we communicate within staff, how we manage up, how we manage down, and those are all leadership skills that you can be a practitioner at a super high level within your discipline, but that does not mean you're able to do those things.
I agree, and I don't want to keep going down this path because I feel like we could keep talking about this because
Yeah.
you're very good at this in the management space. That's why who you are and what you've done. And I want to pivot here to where I reached out and wanted to learn from you, and this is the concept of tactical periodization, which I know you've spent a lot of time over recent years learning from the experts overseas, Vitor Frade being the name there, but also in my own personal interests. When I was coaching soccer, I just really enjoyed just the concept of, okay, how do we periodize the coaching plan, right? You talk about periodization models in rehab and periodization models in performance training, but layering that into sport at the time when I was working soccer was new to me. So I was fascinated by it, and I've gotten away from it in recent years, and now having the opportunity to revisit that, I feel that my understanding is not nowhere near where it needs to be able to say I understand what it is.
Yeah.
So here's why we're here. So with that, I would love for those that are unfamiliar with the concept of tactical periodization, could you, high level, before we get into the weeds, high level, share your perspective on what that is?
Yes. So, yeah, through the 70s and 80s, Vitor Frade and University in Porto created this methodology. I think you'd have to call it a methodology called tactile periodization. Professor Frade is, and we'll get into this, I think, further, provocative in a lot of his ideas, and he used the term tactile periodization not because you're periodizing tactics, you're periodizing your the tactical understanding of the team throughout the year. It was meant to be provocative, and it is this very much this holistic understanding of the training process that I find extremely enlightening and ahead of its time. And I think it's really interesting because currently, if we were to look at the top coaches in the world, and you've got, the Spanish and the Portuguese are probably the biggest producers of top level coaching talent. And you have Professor Frade with tactile periodization. In Portugal, you have Paco Cirillo, who was at FC Barcelona, and the structured training concept. Lots of crossovers between the two, lots of similarities, and it's really their. It's probably cliche to say it's their holistic way of seeing it, but what I really appreciate about the approach is the starting point is understanding complexity, and the starting point of understanding complexity is that we have the physical, we have the emotional, we have the cognitive piece to athletes and training of athletes, and you cannot separate them. We want to separate them. We want to just take one little element of the physical out and train it, and then send the athlete back in and think that we're helping the athlete. We we would love it if it was so reductionist that we could just train purely on the physical side, and we make that athlete better at their sport. And yet you cannot touch you cannot train anything in isolation. So I think that's the starting point. Then how does that influence how you set up your training weeks? And the concept truly of tactile periodization is you have the creation of what they call this morpho cycle, this week to week cycle of training. And the morpho cycle is again this living, breathing methodology of doing certain types of activities on certain days based on getting your group to arrive where they need to be at on game day. So I think that's at a high level. I think that's what tactile periodization is.
What drew your interest to go deeper into learning
Yeah.
Frade's work over
Well,
recent
it's funny
years?
because I think, as I stopped playing and then I went through this degree in coaching science, I had the opportunity in 2004 to do the Czech um, A license in Prague and studied out of Charles University in Prague. And there was a lot of the Eastern European methodology and in terms of how they saw the training process, building microcycles, very Russian in a lot of the background, and it was very influential on me. I think in my my 30s, that thought process was highly influential on me. And then go to the NBA, come back to MLS and soccer, and I remember just thinking, I wanna challenge myself a little bit more, and I looked around between the Spanish and the Portuguese, who had some educational offerings that could be beneficial. And Vitor Frade's group, the Tactile Periodization organization, had a master's course available, and mine was the third English language cohort in the Tactile Periodization school that they offered out of Porto. And then I spent 2 weeks in Porto during that time, and it was everything that I wanted. But again, I think far more stretched you far more than I would have thought to start the process.
There's two names you said, and there's a third name I haven't heard yet. I'm just curious if it's related or not. We've talked Vitor Frade. We've talked. I'm gonna mispronounce his name, but the Spanish teacher
Yep.
Ciro Lu.
Yep.
The other one I've seen and is Raymond Verheyen,
Yep.
out of the Dutch. How does Verheyen's work? If you're familiar with it, if you're not, we can skip this. Is there something similar from the Dutch aspect in Verheyen over there, or am I completely off?
No, I think there's lots of similarities. I think again, most of these methodologies are very, controversial for the American practitioner, really centered around specificity, right? I
Mm-hmm.
think that understanding what truly specificity means, and Verheyen also has a very similar version of how you build this periodization model aimed around specificity. Subtly different in some ways, but lots of similarities between the three. Yeah.
The like to keep it high level here, like as you were describing things and as you were just comparing your like let's just bucket it to like international, probably European
Yep.
over there to the American thought process. Like I think the words that came to mind is like the systems thinking versus reductionist approach.
Yep.
Um, and it sounds like this perspective of tactical periodization falls in line with complex systems versus I think that's Cyril Lou's book, right? Complex
Yeah.
thinking in
Complex
soccer.
football there is a book called Complex Football that looks at first half of the book is on tactile periodization and the second half is on structured training, I think, or vice versa. Javier Mayo is the author of that
Yep.
book.
Yep. There's that one. And then I think about like relative to my field in particular, you think about physical therapy, performance
Yep.
training. A lot of continuing education in this country is this reductionism algorithm, if this, then that, and do
Yes.
this exercise for this activity, do this protocol for this surgery. And yet, as you alluded to, and it's so much more complex than that. And there's the perspective of I can hear, the crowd, the peanut gallery in the back. But Adam, what about the biopsychosocial model? I think we talk about that really well. We acknowledge it, and in this country, I don't think we do a good enough job teaching and programming for that, which leads me to the perspective of how we can learn from the tactical periodization model and what you've learned and tie that into more of the not necessarily the team setting, but also in physical therapy, return to
Yep.
play, performance training, right? There's so much more. So let's double click in on some of the core principles that could help better define and create this better understanding of what tactical periodization is.
Yeah. I think again, to better understand tactile periodization, it does all come down to, I know I would probably keep repeating this, tying together the physical, emotional, and cognitive, and the inability to break them apart. Because again, I think we always want to break them apart. And one of the things that I found is that I didn't actually truly understand tactile periodization until you literally go to Portugal and you meet the people and you see how they value the emotional in a way that we just don't. They value, and for example, one of the big pieces of tactile periodization and the neuroscience piece we study a lot, Antonio Damasio, who I think is he's the head of a neuroscience department in one of the, I don't want to get it wrong, one of the California universities. And he has this saying that's very often used within tactical periodization, is that we are feeling beings that think. We are not thinking beings that feel, right? And I think that there's that underpinning of tactile periodization that's very profound. That is a starting point. That it is this feeling, sensing. We are feeling and sensing athletes that oftentimes we get so caught up in just wanting to improve the biomechanical, with our blinders on, that I think when you go to Portugal or Spain and you're around these coaches, you sense that. And I was on another podcast and I used this story that I thought was, this is fascinating to me, where there was an interview with a leadership interview with Jose Mourinho, and Jose Mourinho, who is one of the top, probably practitioners of tactical periodization in the world. So this leadership group does an interview with what has he learned as a leader, within soccer, and they asked him, um, tell us some of your first memories about the game. He says very clearly, and just with so much emotion, he says, his father was a coach as well, and he says, I remember being a child. I remember being as a child in the locker room, and I remember the sound of the cleats on the floor as the players walked out, and I remember the smell of the icy balm that the players put on before they walked out. And my first memories, I so strongly believe those things, I remember those things, and I remember thinking, that does not sound like an American coach. American coach is not going to describe these really sensory type things as like the foundation of them becoming a coach. And again, I think because we have this such a reductionist view on things, we don't take that into account, and then it manifests into things like one of the top debated areas in soccer. Let's say is the post game top ups, where you got to do your post game top up runnings, post game conditioning. Guys didn't get enough, so we got to go run them. And yeah, I mean, there's probably some use for some running post game, but one, we don't know what emotional state they're going to be in when they ask them to run. And two, there's nothing cognitive about them just running. We as practitioners feel really comfortable if all of our guys get 600 meters of high speed running, running up and back after a game. And if you watch any soccer game on TV, you'll always see the TV people are on, you see the players running back and forth post game. And while there is a fraction of value of doing that, I will tell you, it is not near the value that people think that it does, because there's so many sports scientists that think, well, I need my players to get whatever it is, 1,500 meters of high-speed running every week to stay on there where they need to be at. But getting 500 meters, 600 meters of high-speed running and 11 during the week and on the field after the game, it's not comparable at all, because we're missing those pieces that I was referring to before.
The thought that comes to mind is job safety is one, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. Like needing to have value. I think there's an expression I learned as our staff grew in NBA staffs, and you have more and more providers and people that want to help, but honestly, you have 15 players and you have 9 practitioners. Like, you're not going to work with every player every day. And it was this expression of, sometimes doing your job is to do nothing. And that's hard, because how do I prove my worth or my value if I'm not doing anything? So I share that perspective, and I'm in agreement with you. When I was working at MLS, that's what we would do. And I can promise you the amount of times I politely got told to fuck off during post-game runs. They're like, Adam, this is pointless. I'm just going to come in tomorrow and we're going to play small-sided. And again, like, being uneducated, thinking that was the right thing to do at the time. I did it. I endured the cursing at me the entire time. But to your point, it's nowhere near the same intensity, the cognitive side, the decision-making, the intent, right? All of that comes into play when you start playing the small-sided games and you start playing rather than in isolation, the reductionist approach of, like you said, sports scientist is concerned about the acute chronic of high-speed running, and they need to hit this threshold in order to continue to be fit or have this amount of exposures to max velocity sprints during the week, because that's protective of injury. Like, those things matter, and doing them in isolation versus doing them in the context of the sport is drastically different, like you alluded to.
Correct. Yeah, and so I think that it's. I'm trying to think where I would take the next statement. And there's various things. It's really interesting where Jurgen Klopp, who was at Liverpool, who just retired from Liverpool last year, bring in two coaches from the tactical periodization school. One was Pep Linders, who's actually a Dutch coach that was at PSV Eindhoven, went to the Porto youth under Vitor Frade, and then became Klopp's assistant, and then one of his colleagues from Porto, Vitor Matos. So the two of them went with Jurgen Klopp and his staff at Liverpool. And there's a statement, Pep Linders has a book that's chronicling a year at Liverpool. And he has a statement within there that, which I love, which again, it's very provocative, where he says, linear running is the enemy of intensity in soccer. And your first thought is like, well, no, that's not true. Like, because when we think about high speed running, we think about these 30, 40, 50 meter high speed runs. And the point is that when athletes go make these 40, 50 yard sprints, high speed running, they're shutting off their brain. They're not thinking. They're just going. And the game is, I'm scanning, I'm reading, I'm processing, I'm going 5 yards here, 10 yards there, 5 yards here, I'm closing down. If I get the ball, I know where I'm going to play it. There's that whole, again, this idea of complexity. There's all of these things going on that I've got to process. I'm getting pushed. I'm emotional. We're losing. And the 40 to 50 yard run with no context is the enemy of that. And so I think, again, there's these little provocative statements coming out that I think challenge us, especially as Americans in our performance rehab space, that I think shows us that we're missing just a few parts of the big picture.
This leads me to I'm going to ask a provocative question, talking about provocative statements. Yes. And that is, the common language you'll see in European culture is you have a fitness coach, right? It's not a strength and conditioning coach. In a lot of American sports, it's the strength and conditioning coach. And this thought has come to mind. An elite sport, right? When you start talking about the cognitive aspect, you start talking about the interplay of game. And the profession in this country, and by all means, like, support this profession and believe it's valuable, and there's premises there. But as a maybe the semantics of it, like, where is the value of true strength and conditioning in sport versus the things that you're alluding to that intertwine it all together?
That is a nice provocative question. Yeah, I think, again, the use of the term fitness coach is because you're not trying to be bound to just one area, one type of work. Because it does come down to, and I think, you were asking before about Raymond Verheyen, and what I liked about the starting point of Verheyen's mindset is we have a way of playing. We want to have more, he will call them football actions, right? Football actions. We want to have more football actions per minute or per time period as we can. And we want to be able to keep performing those explosive football actions as often as we can over the course of the game. And that is literally all that matters. If we are Liverpool, can we continue to press for 90 minutes? Can we, with the same level of explosiveness, step, accelerate, decelerate, close guys down, can we do that for 90 minutes? And how are we actually doing that best? Right. And so that is why, the person responsible is called the fitness coach, because it is a more probably general term. And the goal is what we're measuring, I think, on the field. And I think it comes down to what we're measuring on the field is the most important, because we have a way that we want to play. We want to be able to play that way for 90 plus, now 96, 97 minutes. We want to be able to do that twice a week when we have to. And it's those physical qualities. It's the specificity around the physical qualities that we need on the field that are reproduced over and over and over again. I think it comes down to the U.S. soccer player. It is not a lack of athleticism. It is not. So sometimes spending more time in the weight room, that's not what they need. That's not what helps them, because they're already strong and fast enough. And as an example, Inter Miami this year, Inter Miami and MLS. They've just broken the record for the most points in an MLS season. They covered the least amount of total distance of any MLS team. They cover the least amount of high-speed running. They cover the least amount of sprinting of every MLS team. But they just broke the record for the most points in MLS history. So it comes back to me. My favorite saying that I use over and over again is, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We have the mindset that bigger, stronger, faster is always better. But now here we've just, right in front of our eyes, now an aging group of MLS players, just world-class players, just broke the record for most points because they can just play soccer better. And so I think, again, I would challenge a lot of people to think about bigger, stronger, faster. Isn't maybe it's the goal of becoming bigger, stronger, faster does not always make us as much of a improved player as we think that it is. And again, I think that's very provocative in itself. It's because it goes back to, we don't cognitively process things as fast as we should, depending on the type of game. We're not technically as good. We don't have fluidity amongst our team when we have the ball. And the issue, going back to like this reductionist, linear thinking mindset, is the average strength conditioning coach says, well, that's not my job, right? And I think maybe that gets back to the strength coach versus the fitness coach concept. Is the fitness coach, again, I don't know if this is necessarily true, but I think it's supporting the coaching staff. And it goes back to, this is how we want to play. This is our game model. This is what our game model looks like when it's working really, really well. And we are all supporting of that game model, and getting away from, I'm the strength coach, I'm in the gym, and my only role is to get guys stronger and faster. That's my only role. And you hear that all the time too. But then it's flipped, of saying, the coaching staff saying, just stay in the gym, your only role is in there as well.
It's a tough place to be sometimes.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that about Miami. That's amazing. And as you were describing that, there's some scenarios that have come up throughout my career when you look at physical output data, whether that was GPS units in soccer or second spectrum data in the NBA. And as you described that, the common theme that I saw over my career was your veteran players often had the least amount of physical data, but could arguably be on a box score some of your best performers. And the perspective I have with that is, like you alluded to, the roster currently at Inter Miami, world-class players, technical skill, unbelievable, the ability to understand the game and the cognitive aspect that you alluded to, probably superior than anyone else in that league, which then begs the question, do I need to work harder? Like the old expression, work harder or work smarter? As you were describing, that came to mind too. So I just wanted to share those perspectives that I observed over my career, and just curious, like, do they fall in line with, as you described, that situation with Miami this past year? Like, does that make sense, or am I off topic here? Am I missing something?
No. I think it comes back to, and again, whether it's tactical periodization or more Spanish viewpoint, there is this overarching concept, I think, of emergent self-organization. We've now seen a little bit in our space in terms of the ecological dynamics approach, and some of the skill acquisition people now overlapping with some of the sports performance side, and the team as a self-organizing organization, which again is speaking about that concept of complexity. And it's really funny to watch. I mean, the really, really good teams, a team like Inter Miami, let's say, where Inter Miami starts, if Messi's playing, I mean, for large portions of the game, Messi, he's just standing. And he's walking and he's taking up space, and the team is working for him. The team is defending around him. They figure out how they're going to defend around him. And he moves a little bit to defend, but they all know that there's going to be 3, 4, 5 times a game that he's going to make the difference. And he's not going to sprint that much until that time comes. But again, if you embrace this concept of self-organization and complexity, then you understand that's why an Inter Miami breaks the MLS record while performing the least amount of physical work in the game, because they've embraced that element of complexity. So we, again, going back to our reductionist approach, we are so stuck on the bigger, faster, stronger. And then, and again, we could look at the NBA is another good place to look at too, because who are the very, very best NBA players right now, right? If you look at a Nikola Jokic or a Luka Doncic, I mean, no one look at them and describe them as great athletes necessarily, but among the very, very best players in the NBA. And why? Obviously, because
What
technically they're good.
I think
Their
the
ability
stat,
to process things, they see things no one else is seeing.
think the is it the last five, maybe last six MVPs have been European, right? And you're starting to see more of that. Like what like the after watching this past Summer Olympics, like everyone's the perspective like 2028 in LA. The growth of the European player, right? You got Wembanyama now in the league too. You keep seeing these European players. You can clearly see the difference in a. I've had an opportunity to work with a few European-based basketball coaches and how they are in comparison to the traditional sport coach that I was a former player, now I might as well coach, and
Yeah,
how they view the game much different. Uh, so yeah, a great point in bringing into the again the NBA side. Some of the best players are now becoming more and more European skill based, albeit like, hey, that they may have some physical qualities, but especially in a sport like basketball where it's smaller spaces, and if you understand where to be at the right time and you get to your spots and then you have the technical ability to make those shots, the physical component,
yeah,
do you need to be that player that is, and I'm going to use this as an example, right? I think back like to the Miami Heat days. Do you need to be that LeBron James that's just going coast to coast, just 250 pounds coming downhill at you? Like you're not going to stop that physical specimen, albeit like, yes, you can overpower that. And is that the solution for everyone? I don't know.
yeah. And again, I don't want to diminish the fact of like there is a minimum baseline athleticism that one must have to play in these leagues. So let's not. I'm not making that case, but I think again it comes back to from the sports performance side, we become so enamored with doing a ton of work to make really, really potentially small physical gains when there's probably other low hanging fruit in terms of game understanding and cognitive processing and decision making and things like that that would make our players far more effective players. That again, I think that's tactile periodization aside as we go into some of the skill acquisition theory, and I think practitioners are now developing in that space. I think they're getting it from that side. So
Let's keep on with the physical side, and just like as we pin, like we keep zooming in on the concept of tactical periodization. You mentioned earlier morphocycles. You mentioned earlier trying to layer in some of the physical side intertwined with the cognitive and tactical side. So if we could like maybe like a practical scenario for those that are unfamiliar with it, like how does, I don't know if it's a single morphocycle, and I don't know what that time period would be
yeah.
in your eyes, or is it like, hey, is it easy just to break it down match day to match day? Like how for those that are unfamiliar, or like where you've advanced your knowledge after learning more about Friday, like how does the physical component change with the perspective of tactical periodization?
Yeah, I think there's some decisions that everyone has to make as coaches over over a week, how you want to train if you have a whole week that that are informed by your understanding of tactile periodization. And as an example, you have a game on Saturday. First thing, do you take Sunday off or do you take Monday off? Right? I think the traditional physical view is, hey, we're going to play Saturday. We're going to come in. We're going to do some low intensity work on Sunday. Because you're more fatigued the second day after, and then we're going to take the second day off, and the day on Sunday is going to help promote recovery, and then Monday's off. And then within tactile periodization, they would say again, because you can't separate these areas, you're emotionally fried on Sunday. If you've played this very intense game on Saturday, and you're not, and it's going to affect your sleep at night, and maybe you just want to be with your family on Sunday and you have this incredibly emotional fatigue, should we really bring them in on Sunday? Or should we give them Sunday off and then come in on Monday? Right? So, Professor Friday would say, I'm going to prioritize the emotional on Sunday and I'm going to let them stay with their families and have this day of emotional recovery because that's what's most important. Which then just means on Monday you have to dose everything effectively because they're not in a very recovered state. So I think that's one of the first decisions you have to make. And then if you look at the course of the week, we do know through research now that it's roughly even within 72 hours after a game, athletes are still not fully recovered, right? So if you play Saturday, Then you have Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. You're still in some level of fatigue. And Professor Friday, being the provocative person he is, would say, you have one day you can train all week. If you play Saturday, Saturday, you really have one true day, and that's Wednesday. On Wednesday, you can do almost whatever you want to. Now, that doesn't mean you only train one day a week. You're doing something potentially 5 days over the week before the next game. But you have one day when you can train however you would like to. And that day is your match day +4, match day -3 if you have a normal week. So that day, that is your biggest day. That is then by nature your most match-like day of training. Then you, if that's the case, then you really have to be careful what you're doing on either side of that day, on the Tuesday or on the Thursday. So if you're still not fully recovering on a Tuesday, then what types of activities should you do on that Tuesday? Now, again, we can prioritize the emotional. Oftentimes, if you look at some of the literature of people that have a looser grasp of tactile periodization, they've used the term like strength day. That's going to be our strength day, and we're going to work in tight spaces, and we're not going to have as many peak velocities, but it's going to be more accels and decels. And from a learning standpoint, that would also be a day when you have more of the micro principles of your game versus the Wednesday that's going to be the macro. If we say the Wednesday, that's 11v11, that's the collective, that's our most game-like. It's all the macro principles of how I want to play. On either side of that day are going to be more micro principles. So now we're addressing the cognitive in that. The Tuesday, they're not ready for the macro. We probably want to stay away from peak velocities because guys are not fully recovered yet. We want to drive the emotional, so it's more smaller competitive games. And so again, you're seeing the layering of this physical, emotional, cognitive, like all together, and how each day fits. Probably before we arrive on Saturday again, we have to have a day, whether it's Thursday or Friday, that we want to regain mental freshness because you want to go into the next game in a really mentally fresh state. Is that best on your match day -1, where we're going to do something less instructional, more lower cognitive load, create freshness, get athletes again in a good mood and ready to go on Saturday? To me, like that's how you see the week through a technical periodization lens and the layering of all of those three areas together.
Is there ever a point in time that becomes even more detailed when you start talking about individualization, player to player, or does that just become too complex, too noisy? The optics are, this player is getting an extra day, this player is not doing as much, this player has to do more. Like, where does if it does, where does individualization fit within that framework?
I think one of the pieces I haven't talked about yet that I think is really key is I think that the very top coaches that have this level of understanding of the training process is that they develop a sensitivity, right? I think as we're looking at this nonlinear response to training, everyone has this nonlinear response to games and training, and the nonlinear aspect becomes this like inputs versus outputs, right? Like, hey, we're always going to do this type of work on this day, and this is going to be the output. Well, we know from a nonlinear perspective that's just not how it is. And so you might have a guy that's overly fatigued that is crushed from the game, or something's happening at home or whatever. But the really, really top coaches develop a sensitivity to say, okay, everyone is recovered through the Tuesday and ready to go on Wednesday. Well, except that guy, he's not recovered yet. Because that, as a coach or as a staff, you have that sensitivity. And so then you do make accommodations for that. But that goes back to the specificity as well, right? We have to make the decision if you're going to do 11v11 in training on Wednesday and the left back has to get up and down and overlap because that's how you want to play, but they're not fully recovered. Well, you can't put them out there the whole time in that game. So you have to have the sensitivity for what the appropriate amount of work is for that particular day. So I think it's the understanding of specificity and the understanding of and having the sensitivity to this nonlinear training process where the inputs and the outputs don't always match up, And it goes back to listen, this is not just a Portuguese type thing. Like I remember a friend of mine who was in the program spent time with Real Madrid when Zidane was coach at Real Madrid, and they would say Some days he would walk in, and they won Champions League the year he was there, and he would walk in on some training days and he'd say, I'm feeling the team's tired. We're just going to do a shooting competition today and be done. Because he had developed, as someone with that much experience in the game, he had developed this level of sensitivity to where his group was at. Right when we were in the NBA, there are stories of Pop where he'd walk out in San Antonio. They'd be training in some city where the court was really poor, and someone said, "Oh, Pop, if Pop walked out on this college court right now, this D3 college court that had not been worked on in years," he'd be like, "No, our players can't tolerate this. We're just going to do some shooting and get out," because they have that sensitivity to what the inputs would be and what the outputs would be on training that particular day.
It's impressive when the coaches develop that, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes I think it goes back to the job of this high performance director type role. I think our job is to support the coaches in helping slowly develop that sense of sensitivity as well, because the coach can't be aware of where all 20 players are at on any given day and what the impact of what their session should be. But if in some ways the role of data in that process is to help support and guide a coach's sensitivity over time, where they're asking questions of us, but they're also developing and kind of tuning their own sense of sensitivity.
I'll throw this statement at you, and we're just curious to see where it lands and what your perspective is on it. A lot of strategies around load management, data, sports science is to educate and either validate or refute the sensitivity of that coach. And where this is coming from is a lot of times I feel like that data and load management strategies and everything we present with all these beautiful reports with data visualization is to help refine that sensitivity for that coach. So just curious if you feel that is a big part of what we're doing when we start talking about load management and giving this information to the coaches to help them, okay, this is what's happening physically. Now, how does this also interlay with what I'm sensing with the players? I don't even know
Yeah,
what the question
I
is
think
there,
that's
Dave, but
accurate. Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's funny. I think sometimes it's the concept of load management has been misconstrued and misportrayed by the media, especially where, let's say, Pop made it more challenging. He would rest guys when they're going to play a more difficult game away that was going to be on TV. And again, I'm not in those rooms. I can't speak for what he was doing. But again, if we believe in this concept of this holistic, physical, emotional, cognitive, Pop's goal was to make sure his group had a level of freshness when they got to the playoffs. That's his ultimate goal. The emotional load of going to play the Lakers away on TV is something he has a sensitivity for. He wants to not give his players that load on that particular day, because his goal is to create freshness for his group at the right time of the year. It's not load management. If they play today, they might get hurt. Well, no, he was never saying that if they played that game, they're going to get hurt. But sometimes I think that's where the press has gone to. And then there's all kinds of, we could spend a whole 2 hours talking about the shift in pro sports from the 80s and 90s to today, and resting players and players afraid of getting hurt. But all we can say is the demands of the game have changed. The emotional demand on these guys with social media is different. Cognitively, what these guys are getting is at a very high level too, in terms of information they're trying to process on a daily basis. And again, I was not there in the 90s, but for sure from the 90s to the 2024s, what we're putting on the players is different. And so how you create freshness for the athlete in 2024 is going to be different than what you would do in the 90s. And I feel like that's the discussion. And meanwhile, injuries have gone up as well. And so, yeah, I think it's not, I guess you'd say this is the best example of there's so much complexity around this and understanding what is the goal of load management, why are athletes getting injured. And, I don't think that people are really asking the right questions, I guess.
I would agree. And I think this is where your background in the sport comes into play, and the background as being a coach comes into play, because you understand some of those thought processes that are going through the minds of players or coaches that you're working with, where vice versa, someone in the American system goes through
Yeah.
undergrad, goes get their doctorate degree in physical therapy, and now they want to work in sports because they like working with athletes and they have all these robust return to play protocols. Yet, how does that match to some of the demands that you had talked about as far as style of play, game strategy, overall tactics within all that, right? So like I think it becomes so much more robust. And I just wanted to hit home on this point that you you mentioned it earlier, and then you're talking about the NBA space that we both worked in, and that being you had said, hey, in soccer literature, what we've known for a while now is that we still have inflammatory markers on blood analysis still elevated, 72 hours post the match. Yet we have in that same time period in the NBA, you could play upwards of 2 to 3 games.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about freshness and this idea of load management in the NBA space, I just wanted to highlight that it's a survival of the fittest game if you're trying to play 82 games. And the question of will you ever be as fresh every game? I think that's debatable and very hard to
Mm.
do, which makes it very challenging in those environments. Hockey probably being another one that plays on kind of a similar cadence of a schedule. How do you even balance all of it, right? In those leagues becomes very, very challenging. And unfortunately, I doubt it will change because in order for it to change, you have to play less games. But in order to play less games, players have to make less money. And I've learned that talking to a few veterans in the league that have educated me on that. It's like, hey, like we talk about load management, like how can we do better? And the only legitimate solution in those leagues that play high volume of games is you have to reduce the games if you really
Yeah.
want to maximize load management, which is why this idea of resting players and allowing more time in between games, because that's ultimately physiologically right. I just go back to physiology, like you alluded to. Like we know 72 hours is really at least what we need in between high intensity efforts like that of a soccer match. So how do you everything that we're trying to do from load management, cold plunge, infrared, sauna, massage, like all those things are advantageous, yet perhaps what really moves the needle is just time in and of itself.
Yeah. I think the nature of the game is though too, right? Because I think,
Mm-hmm.
again, we're talking about soccer where in a soccer game you're playing 96, 97 minutes. And within basketball, if you're playing 35 minutes, you're playing a significant amount of minutes. So you're playing in this constant state of, I think, moderate fatigue, and then depending on the travel, versus I think in soccer, you have this huge effort that promotes this really significant fatigue that then you have to really respond from. So I find like the demands on the players are subtly different, I think, between soccer and basketball. And that's what you're saying. Like you're just, and to me, I'll say that's what was so impressive about seeing the guys in the NBA is like you play a game, you play 35 minutes, you fly the next city, you get in the next day, you just get yourself going again to play 32, 33 more minutes. And their ability to do that game after game was super impressive.
The, a perspective I took is like that rookie wall that happened in for like with January right before you hit All Star break. I just I chalked it up to saying this is your first exposure to this volume of work and travel and stress in your entire life. And so your body's just adapting, saying, okay, I've hit my max level of fatigue. That's why I feel, younger players that endure and play a lot of those games as they approach January, where you're approaching, 50, 55 games, even possibly close to 60 come All-Star break. They just never done it before. But then you look at your veteran players that you were talking about, or the players that have been around. It's like, man, it's amazing that they can do this for 10, 12, 14 years. They've just over time
Yeah.
built up that ability to tolerate that stress and figure out how to manage themselves off the court.
I think it's a good
Because
example of as humans, we respond to patterns, right? And I think that's something that is missed. And oftentimes with tactile periodization, they'll call it the pattern morphocycle, right? You create this pattern that you provide to players week after week after week. So it's this, you're providing these patterns, and then you're always working in the spectrum of redundancy to variability, right? We would always talk about this when I would talk with the staff about what we're doing in training weeks, isn't it? You want some level of redundancy that they're used to doing something, but you always need a little bit of variability. So responding to a pattern, where along the spectrum each week are you going to be more redundant, more variable? And then that is that crossover for me of that art and science of coaching, is how much variability do you bring in to keep creating this emotional challenge, emotional freshness, while still having them respond to the pattern, this weekly pattern that their bodies are used to.
I agree with that. It's tough. It's tough to
Yep.
manage. I want to ask one just practical question, and then I also want to highlight the work that you're doing in the performance space with the conference you're running in Florida later this winter. But this one final like practical component is we've talked a lot about the fitness side, the S&C side, the game side. But where I find value in understanding and appreciating the concepts of tactical periodization come in rehabilitation and return to play. Could you just speak upon your perspective as the value that a lot of the concepts we talked about today can be
Yeah.
implemented or utilized in the medical?
Yeah, I think the rehab process is, again, if we think about the concept of specificity, right? We want to safely bring an injured athlete back to the space of working with specificity as soon as we can in a safe manner. And so it's interesting because obviously, like, one of the frameworks that's heavily used is really this, control to chaos continuum concept that's been, utilized and termed pretty heavily recently. And essentially all that is I am increasing specificity. And as I get to the end stages, I want to cognitively challenge them. I want to emotionally challenge them. I want to challenge them within the nature of their position. And the more I can emotionally ramp them up and make them problem solve, that's the chaos side, right? So if I look at control to chaos continuum and then I overlay that with tactile periodization, I'm just really trying to layer in those three in a higher intensity type way. So how it manifests, I think, with tactile periodization is being really clear with your team. And this is, I think, probably easiest done within soccer in some ways, is how early can you involve an injured player in the training process, right? Because you want them, can they do the warm up? Is the coach okay with them doing the warm up and passing and then coming off? Are they not okay with it? The earlier you can include them with their teammates, you're then increasing specificity to some level. And processing, I think the missing piece is where it goes wrong is if I keep that player to the side and maybe it's the coaches, maybe it's the practitioners, they say, I don't want this player back until they can do everything. This player, from a cognitive processing standpoint, think they're out and they're playing every day and they're processing the game and they're making really good decisions for months, years. If this player has a long-term injury and they're just out, and I don't afford them that ability to cognitively process like they would in a game for months and months, I'm now, it's going to take months until they can actually do that really quickly again. So, sorry, I got my dog's barking there.
No worries. The perspective I have as you talk about that is like I've heard that dichotomy of I only want a player back if he can play 35 minutes. I only want a player back if he can play 90 minutes. But the reality is this idea of it's gotten just as bad as load management has been bastardized in the media. I think the idea
Yep.
of minute progressions and restrictions has gotten bastardized in-house because we
Yep.
think like, oh, we're holding the player back. It's like, no. As a physical therapist, as a performance coach, I could only do so much to prepare this player to play. And in actuality, the final bit of this process, they have to increase the complexity of what they're doing by
Yep.
just playing lower volume of the game. Like players look at it as like, oh, you're holding me back. Coaches look like, oh, man, like, can I just have him back so I don't have to think about this and I can go about just planning my rotations as usual, right? It's often missed that it's just part of the ability to progress logically when you
Yes.
are trying to go from such a specific reductionist approach early on where you're trying to restore range of motion, reduce pain, increase strength. Yeah, like that bit of it's important. But ultimately, like everything you've talked about here is the emotional, the cognitive, the decision making. Like no PT or performance coach is ever going to be able to replicate that. We
No.
try. We all try
Yep.
making creative, fancy drills with our GPS units and like, okay, we're going to get 10 actions per minute. They got to be a minimum of 5 meters. We got to, make sure we're covering this ground on this part of the field. We've got to service this ball in. Like I've tried doing that and it just never replicates it. So we'll finish this perspective on it's important I'm glad you brought up the control chaos continuum because when I saw that paper come out, I thought to myself, Yeah, that makes sense. That's my mind. Like when I read it, I was like, yeah, it's tactical periodization. They're doing that in Europe. Like
Yeah.
it's just coming mainstay here in this country. So appreciate you highlighting that.
Yeah.
Let's wrap it up here, and I want to call out the work that you're doing within soccer within this country for the PSPA. The remind me what the PSPA is abbreviated for.
Professional Soccer Performance Association.
There it is. I love our
Yep.
acronyms here. And
Yep.
so could you highlight like the intention behind, you are the president of that, creating this, and then what you hope to bring to the soccer community, and not only the soccer community, just the performance community, by running this conference here in December.
Yeah. It is a community of all the performance practitioners within MLS First Team and MLS Next Pro. And to be fair, I think we've been super supported by the league, by MLS. There's a series of subcommittees in MLS that look at things like scheduling, rain delay procedures, research paper approval, things like that. Where um, as we've kind of asked for participation, acknowledgement in some of those subcommittees, I mean, they've come back and said, obviously the athletic trainers have done a remarkable job, I think, creating their PSATs and some of the different associations, depending on the sports. They've done a great job organizationally creating a community that has gained acknowledgement at the league level. And so I think MLS has asked us to do the same to gain some participation in those subcommittees. And so we've with their blessing gone forward and created this community of soccer performance um, professionals. And we had a small kind of intro conference last year. We'll do our first conference for anyone in the soccer community or non-soccer community, December 12th and 13th in Fort Lauderdale. And it's again, I think the goal is to really be as inclusive as possible. I think we see economies in scale. We want to have a voice for all soccer performance people. I mean, you have been one yourself, and I think there's there's enough really really good people in our community that I think we want to give a voice to, and so we've kind of come together and have a really good conference. I mean, Martin Bouchette will be speaking there, Les Spellman, Rick Koss from US, Stacy Harden was a physical therapist, athletic trainer, has worked in MLS and NWSL. So it's a really, really good group of speakers. We'll give some opportunity to some of the people within the league to speak as well. So I think it's gonna be an exciting activity event.
You definitely have done a great job putting together a great lineup. You mentioned some names, and a few of them have been on the show previously, so I'm excited to see them get their flowers and have opportunities to continue to speak in front of a larger audience, because you highlighted some great practitioners there. That, again, like you said, it's not as popular in this country, the sport of soccer, but there are incredible practitioners, and to hear you say, "Hey, we just want to give them a voice with this community," I think is I commend that, and you've always done a fantastic job putting together these communities and these conferences, and just bringing great opportunities to connect, but also learn at the same time from
Yeah.
great people.
Well, Garrison Draper is the vice president of the association as well. And he's just done a amazing job doing all the legwork, being in Fort Lauderdale himself. So we would not be where we're at without the work that Garrison's done. So.
Well, shout out to Garrison. We can appreciate having the help that we have. Dave, last question I have for you. We here in this podcast, we always just try to learn from everybody's experiences in the sport. Not everyone here that listens works in sports. So some want to work in sports, and also some people just listen to learn from what's perceived as high quality practitioners that work with athletes. And I always like to ask the question of, how are you advising people or giving the advice for people that want to make small changes, try and find their small wins as they go on their performance journey or health and performance, right? Because you've been exposed to so much good stuff being in the pro space, that I think we oftentimes forget that what becomes second nature to us in these elite levels can be groundbreaking for people on the outside looking in. So just really
Yeah.
curious if you have any advice for people looking to upgrade their own health and performance.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it's funny that I mean, almost all the different areas we talked about today. It's really about asking the right questions. I think that we always we kind of meander along this path along our career and we think we know where we're going. And then, we realized, I think we all hit this point where we realized we weren't really asking the right questions along the way, and I think the nature of, this talk with the tactile periodization side, I think, for me, it's the dynamic systems, understanding complexity, like those areas, like all of a sudden I felt like I was not asking the right questions, right? And I think we are a product of the culture we grew up in, and I think especially with us, especially the Northern European American um, background, is that we do love our linear thinking. We love our linear thinking, right? And so I think trying to take space to really pull away and and really think about, am I just thinking this because this is where I'm at in my career? Am I thinking this because this is how I grew up? And um, I know probably more philosophical than maybe you're looking for, but I just think it's understanding the dynamic environment we live in is so important, and I think that's people just miss it. We definitely live in a more is better at all times um, society that I think if you step away, you can kind of see we're products of that.
I would agree, and not too philosophical at all. Like I think it's great. It's a great perspective. I wasn't looking for like, oh yeah, do this habit every, add this to your morning routine. Wasn't looking for that from you, not at all. Dave, it was wonderful to catch up, man. I'm glad we were able to do this, and we will make sure we add the notes here for listeners to tune into the conference coming up in December. I think if anyone that's interested in soccer, again, a lot of listeners want to work in sport but don't know how to get into it. They feel like it's the, boys or, the country club. So going to these events that Dave puts on and Garrison are just great opportunities to try and be in the room, is how I tell people. Like, if you want to work somewhere, you want the next opportunity, just be in the room and be a sponge. So we will add that in there. And as always, Dave, thank you for coming
I
on.
appreciate you having me. Good to catch up.